They were the most feared order in all of Christendom. Warriors of God on the outside, sworn keepers of forbidden knowledge on the inside. The Knights Templar held secrets that could destroy empires. Kings betrayed them, popes cursed them. Fires were lit not to punish, but to silence. Tonight, on Medieval History, we uncover what they died to protect, the rituals, the relics, the truth they buried beneath stone and blood. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. The stone groaned beneath the hooves of the warhorse, slow and heavy like the turning of an ancient clock. Fog coiled along the cracked flagstones, rising like lost souls through the broken arches of a temple long forsaken. Moss devoured the carvings of saints, their faces weathered smooth by centuries of silence. Somewhere above, a raven called once, then twice, its cry cutting through the hush like a warning. Then wings beat, and it vanished into the ash-colored sky. Within the sanctuary's hollow heart, beneath the collapsed dome where stars once watched holy men kneel, a single knight knelt now in stillness. His armor bore the dents of old Crusades, his white mantle, soiled and torn, draped over weary shoulders. Upon it, the red cross, the mark of a sacred brotherhood, now stained not by blood, but betrayal. He was not praying. Those days had passed. His gauntlets lay beside him, abandoned like shields before surrender. In bare hands, scarred and trembling, he held a tarnished reliquary, its metal bruised, its gems dulled. He brought it close, breathing in the cold scent of stone, damp earth, and the lingering ghost of incense. A sacred object, yes, but also a curse. They had called him Brother Amen once, a knight of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. He had been celebrated in Acre, revered in Damascus, blessed in Jerusalem. He had taken the oath, poverty, chastity, obedience, and vengeance, with fire in his chest. But all fires die eventually. What remained in his now was not faith. It was knowing. In the folds of his cloak, wrapped carefully in cloth once used to anoint the dead, lay a scroll. Its ink faded, its words penned in a tongue no longer spoken, whispered only by those close to death. The scroll had been hidden beneath the altar of a buried chapel, deep in the catacombs under Acre, guarded not by locks, but by silence, forgotten by time, but not by purpose. What he had found was no map to treasure, no list of names, no plot against kings. It was older than the order, older than Christendom. It was something remembered, had read it by candlelight, the vaults trembling with cold, the wax dripping onto stone, etched with symbols not taught in any monastic school. As the words unfolded, he felt the order's foundation crack. The blood oaths, the rituals, the relics, all built to top something far more dangerous than heresy. And now they hunted him. Not the Saracens, not thieves, not even Rome, his own brothers, men he had trained with, prayed with, wept beside, on moonlit marches now, turned into shadows that moved with daggers and silence. For the truth he carried was not a crown to be seized. It was a wound, one that would knock close. Outside the ruined temple, the bell tolled again, not from any church, but distant in the hills. A shepherd's bell, perhaps, or something older, something that rang when secrets stirred. He did not rise. Instead, he ran a finger along the reliquary's edge, its cold silver biting back. His breath misted the surface, fogging it like a mirror. And for a moment, he saw the vault again, flickers of blue fire dancing along stone, the scent of myrrh thick in his throat, a voice speaking his name in a language that did not belong to this world. He remembered falling. He remembered screaming, and then waking with the scroll in his hands, and the vault door sealed behind him. He had fled Acre under moonlight, disguised as a beggar. He had crossed rivers, bribed guards, traded his sword for silence. And now he was here not to hide, but to decide. He could burn it, the scroll, the reliquary, the last remnant of the truth he was never meant to hold. But would that unmake what he had seen? A wind stirred through the broken temple, lifting dust and the faint memory of chant. The crucifix above the altar cracked down its center, wept. Rainwater from the eyes of Christ. The ravens gathered again, 3 now, watching from the rafters, like witnesses in the distance. Hooves he had until dusk. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in mourning, for the man he had been, for the brothers who would soon come to kill him, for the world that clung to its myths, too afraid to question what they were truly built upon. Ammon rose, slow as stone, and strapped the reliquary to his chest. He tucked the scroll beneath his mantle, close to his ribs, where no blade would take it without taking him. His warhorse snorted beside the column, pawing at the earth. The air was changing. The hunt had begun. He did not flee. He walked into the fog, toward the bell, toward the hills, toward whatever came next. Let them follow. Let them try. The truth, once unearthed, does not go quietly back to sleep, and neither would he. The last candle surrendered with a sigh, its wick curling like a dying breath, the wax bleeding down the iron holder onto cold stone. Darkness settled not with violence, but with ritual, slow, inevitable, complete. In the chamber beneath Chateau de Chinon, time no longer moved forward. It coiled in corners, like the damp mist that slid down the walls. The air was thick with mildew and memory, an ancient weight pressing down on 3 men once known by kings and feared by armies. Now they sat hunched in their chains, cloaks, clinging like shadows to bone. Not one had spoken in hours. Rain dripped through the cracks above, each tap a cruel reminder of life, still moving beyond their tomb of silence. It tapped like fingers, impatient, indifferent. Eternal. Jacques de Maule sat stillest of all. His face, carved by age and scorched by sun from years in the Levant, bore lines not just of war, but of watching dreams unravel. His beard was matted with dust and sweat. His lips were cracked, but his eyes, those pale, unflinching eyes, held the weight of 1,000 prayers unanswered. He stared at the far wall where green moss crept upward, slow and greedy, toward a fading sigil carved long ago by hands now bones, a cross flanked by 2 swords, the seal of the order now flaking into obscurity. But Jacques saw more than stone. In the moss-lined cracks he saw fire, the flicker of torches at the Jerusalem commandery, lighting the corridors of stone where knights swore vows before the altar. He heard again the Latin chants echoing through those vaulted halls. He remembered the scent of oil on new armor, the trembling hands of novices being anointed with holy balm. He saw again the crimson tide at Hatton, the broken lances, the dust rising behind 1,000 hooves as they rode to protect pilgrims who would never know their names. They had built an empire not of land, but of faith, and now it was dissolving. not by sword, but by ink, by decree, by betrayal, sealed. With a papal ring and a king's trembling hand, the Pope, the very voice of Christendom, had turned away, not for doctrine, not for justice, but for fear, for power, and for the promises whispered by Felipe IV in shadowed corridors. A king in debt can offer no mercy. And Felipe owed gold, much of it, to the men now bound in chains. Outside, thunder rolled low across the Loire like distant drums of war, though no army would come for them. Their war was over. Their enemy now wore silk, not mail, and his sword was the scribe's feather. Malay's breath rattled as he reached beneath his soiled robe. From its folds he drew something fragile, a sliver of white linen, its edges frayed by salt and time. It bore symbols not of France or Rome, but of deserts far from these walls. Symbols written in ink so faded it looked like bruises on the cloth. Letters no cleric in Chinon could decipher. It had been smuggled out of Cyprus years ago, hidden within the cloak of a merchant who never spoke again. Some believed it was a relic, others a map. But to Malay, it was memory, the last echo of a truth too dangerous for parchment. It pulsed with the silence of ancient places. He pressed it to his chest, against his heart that still, somehow, dared to beat. The other two men shifted beside him, Geoffrey de Charny and Hugh de Perrot, brothers, not just in title, but in fire and in fall. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their silence was not fear. It was defiance. And still, the door groaned open. Its hinges cried like a heretic's last plea. The torchlight returned, flickering across the damp stones like serpents of flame. Boots scraped forward, metal clinked, and with them, as always, came the parchment, the confession. It was placed before them like meat before condemned men, a falsehood to be consumed with ink and surrender. Mullah did not look down. He stood slowly. The weight of chains dragging against the stone sounded louder than thunder. The jailer said nothing. He didn't need to. The terms were clear. Sign and your body is spared, if not your soul. Refuse and be erased. Malay's fingers brushed the linen once more, and in that moment, beneath the flicker of dying firelight, the symbols glinted, not with ink, but with gold, as if something beneath the dust had awakened. It shimmered, brief and terrible, like the glint of truth through layers of lies. The jailer stepped back. Malay's voice was quiet, like a wind before storm. You may burn the body, he said, but the flame will not reach what we carried. He did not reach for the quill. He turned, walking toward the wall, toward the cross that faded into moss. He touched the stone with a reverence deeper than fear, as if speaking to the order itself, not as it was, but as it had once dared to be. Beyond the door, a priest muttered absolution none of them asked for. The confession lay untouched. The chains remained, but so did the linen, pressed to Malay's chest like a heartbeat of something buried, not broken. And outside, the rain changed. It came harder, now colder, as if washing away the ink before it could dry, as if baptizing the world again before it forgot. They would burn him, not today, but soon. The order would fall. Its halls emptied, its gold scattered, its name blackened, but in the secret folds of the linen the truth still breathed. It would wait beneath the ashes. It would wait in the silence between centuries. It would wait for fire to return. The sky over Constantinople was bruised purple, stitched with a thread of dying stars. Morning had not yet broken, but the city breathed, low and restless. And in that in-between hour, where shadow clung to stone and silence to breath, a child ran. He ran barefoot, each step slapping against the freezing cobbles, his soles cut and numb with winter. Mud clung to him like memory. His breath steamed in ragged bursts. Behind him, the sound of iron, greaves striking stone, boots in rhythm, Templars. He didn't cry out. He didn't look back again. He had already seen them once. The pale gleam of a crimson cross against white, the gloved hand resting on the hilt of a blade too often used. That was enough. The alleys swallowed him like a secret. He ducked beneath laundry lines frozen stiff in midair, twisted through butcher stalls. Not yet scrubbed, fish guts slicked the path. He slipped, fell, caught himself, kept running. Beneath his tunic, tied tight against his ribs, the satchel knocked with each breath. Inside, it lay no gold, no holy relic, no indulgence writ by popes. What it held was quieter, older, a book, bark-bound, ink-stained, a codex written in tongues that had not been spoken aloud in generations. Half Arabic, half Hebrew, veined with stars, with alchemical rings and sigils carved in ink that bled rust when damp. He did not know the words, but he knew the warnings. The nuns had told him stories, whispered between prayers and candle smoke, a vow made not by kings or cardinals, but by those who dwelt in silence, who guarded truth not in fortresses. Archway, the stone still blackened by flame, snow resting in the crevices like bone dust. He dropped into the ruins of a chapel, once grand, now a husk of memory. The altar had collapsed. Mosaics flaked from the walls, but beneath it, a narrow stair gaped like a wound in the earth. Down the air, thickened, moist, cold, smelled of candle, wax and decay. At the bottom stood a figure draped in threadbare robes, head bowed. A man whose eyes were pale and unfocused, milk-white with blindness, but sharp with something deeper. He did not speak until the boy reached him. "Do you know what you carry?" he asked, not as challenge, but as ritual. The boy didn't answer. He only looked toward the icon above the ruined altar. The Virgin's face had long since faded, her eyes chipped away by time or knife, but still she gazed down. The monk pressed a trembling hand to her chest. A click, a drawer, hidden behind the stone, opened with the hush of old secrets. Inside, linen, dust, silence, space for the codex. The boy untied the satchel and offered it. The monk held it with reverence, his hands shaking as if the weight would crack his bones. A breath passed between them. Then, in a whisper, almost lost to the stones, "Let the watchers sleep." He placed the codex within, then closed the drawer with finality, not as if hiding something, but as if sealing a promise. Outside, the echo of footsteps grew louder, more defined. The boy moved to the crypt's door, eased it shut. Darkness pressed in, but it wasn't the kind of dark that brought fear. It was the dark of soil before seed, of breath held, of something about to change. He listened, counted heartbeats. The Templars passed above. Their torches flared and faded. The city held its breath, and in that stillness, a thought bloomed in the boy's chest, unformed but undeniable. Truth was not a relic. It was not glass behind cathedral walls, or gold locked behind Vatican doors. It was not what kings decreed, nor what priests repeated. Truth moved, it whispered, it hid in those small enough to go unnoticed, in alleys cold enough to sting, in fingers too young to tremble. The monk was gone now, vanished into the crypt's deeper corridors, or perhaps he had never been fully there at all. The boy stood alone, his satchel empty, but he felt heavier than before, not with burden, but with meaning. He climbed the steps again into dawn. The streets of Constantinople were stirring now. A vendor yawned behind a bread cart. A stray cat dashed through melting snow. Life resumed. The chase forgotten, but the boy remembered. And far beyond these streets, across the frozen Alps, beneath the sands of Jerusalem, in the vaulted chambers of the Templar strongholds, others would soon feel the ripple of what had just shifted. The codex was no longer in motion, but the truth it carried was. And as the sun cracked the sky open, spilling gold over the domes and towers, the boy disappeared once more into the crowd. No name, no title, no reward, only the silence of one who knew, because what he carried now was not the book, it was the story, and stories, when carried by the forgotten, are the hardest to kill. The wind moaned like a wounded spirit through the scorched ribs of the Abbey of Montsegur, clawing through stone halls with the chill of judgment. Where once hymns rose from cloisters, now silence reigned, broken only by the brittle flutter of torn banners peeling from the rafters. They danced like remnants of forgotten vows red, black. Snow fell with solemn purpose, gathering on shattered sills and pooling in the mouths of ruined gargoyles. Inside the abbey's ruined refectory, a dim glow clung to the faces of 7 figures gathered in a half-circle. Time itself seemed suspended. They did not speak. They dared not. At the center stood Sister Therese, a nun of no fame, no title, only purpose. Her hands, calloused from years of ink and prayer, now trembled as they hovered above a chest too plain to deserve reverence, yet too dangerous to ignore. The iron was pitted, worn to shadow by age, but the mark upon it, the twin rider cross of the Templars, remained sharp as a wound, not painted, etched, not decoration. Warning behind her, the knight stood like stone in the smoke. His helm remained fixed to his face, not for war, but for anonymity. His voice had not graced the room since he arrived. His sword, streaked with dried wax and blood, had not left his side. No one asked his name. No one wanted to know. Could feel the weight of memory thick in the air, as if the stones themselves remembered screams, remembered fire, remembered what they were never meant to see. They were survivors, not of a battle, but of a secret too dangerous for kings, too holy for priests, one that had slipped through centuries like a shadow behind every throne. They had each borne witness to fragments, a whisper in Jerusalem, a symbol scrawled in a monk's margin, a chant heard only during eclipses, alone, meaningless. Together, prophecy. The chest held no relic, no gilded bones, no heretical gospel, only parchment trapped in oiled cloth, to keep rot at bay, marked in languages older than Latin, older than the cathedrals that sought to bury them, symbols that did not belong to any one faith, but all, scripts that spoke of a brotherhood born in silence, behind the veil of the official order, the Templars within the Templars. It was not conspiracy, it was conviction. Beneath the Temple Mount, it said, a vision had been seen, not by the eyes, but the soul, a darkness that could not be described, a voice that called itself light, but asked for worship without question. They had buried it in silence, calling it divine, but some had understood, and some had warned. 2 nights prior, the warning came to flesh. A rider, soaked in river mud and blood, stumbled through the gates before collapsing at Theres' feet. He held no sword, only the chest. His lips moved, but no sound came. Only when they pried the bloodied scroll from his tunic did they see it. His mouth had been sewn shut with black thread, the kind used only in one place, the dungeons beneath Avignon. He died before dawn, eyes wide, as if, even in death, he watched something drawing near. Theres pressed her fingers into blessed oil and made the sign of the cross on the scroll's ribbon. Her voice barely rose above the wind. Let no hand open this but one who has seen the darkness and did not look away. The knight gave a single nod. He stepped forward, lifting the chest with a grunt that echoed off the walls like a dirge. Behind him, the others bowed not to him, but to what he carried, to the burden now passed again, like a flame wrapped in rags. Snow drifted through the cracks in the abbey walls, mixing with smoke from a fire still smoldering in the tower. They had set it themselves, burned the bell, the banners, the records. What could not be carried would be erased. They would vanish into ash like so many before them, but not the truth, never the truth, because truth, Theres believed, does not live in stone or scrolls. It moves, it survives in exile, in fragments passed hand to hand, in children born with questions in their blood, in orders hidden within orders. As the night descended the hidden stairwell behind the altar, torchlight briefly caught the edge of the chest, just enough to illuminate a second mark beneath the twin riders, faint, nearly erased, a circle of thorns outside. The snow fell harder. The last tower groaned under its own weight. The mountains around them stood silent, eternal sentinels to a war that was never declared but always waged. And as the heavy door groaned shut behind the night, sealing the passage from the wind, Theres whispered into the emptiness, "Guard him." Her fingers curled in prayer, not to saints, but to memory, because even as flames licked the sky and the abbey's bones gave way, the knowledge within that chest walked away from Montsegur, quiet, alive, and somewhere far below the mountains. Spine, a chamber, waited in darkness for the return of what should never have existed. By torchlight, the old map room beneath Roslyn Chapel breathed like something alive and dying. Dust hung in the air like spirits waiting to be named. The scent of wax and old parchment mingled with something colder, metallic, as if the stones had remembered blood. Brother Alaric, his robes frayed and patched, stood before the carved wall where angels and swords danced in silence, half lost to time. He reached out, letting his fingers rest in the groove of a vine that turned into a star. The stone was warm, or was it trembling? For years, he had come here to pray, to read, to question. This room, beneath the sacred bones of Roslyn, was a reliquary of forgotten truths, a vault built not only to protect, but to silence. But tonight, something ancient had stirred. A visitor had come, not in armor, not with a cross, but wrapped in the dust of desert roads, his voice carrying the cadence of prophecy. The scholar from the east stood barefoot on the chapel's cold stones. His scrolls were wrapped in oilcloth, their edges burnt by time and salted air. Persian, Syriac, languages that hadn't spoken to the Western Church in centuries. He did not bow. He placed the scrolls between them like offerings and said only, "I've followed a dream that began before Jerusalem fell." Alaric had scoffed, but now he was afraid. The ink on the parchment had barely faded, and the symbols, stars, eclipses, gates, echoed those on Roslin's walls. Not copies, not echoes, twins. "Where did you find these?" Alaric asked. "Not found," the scholar replied. "Remembered. An orb, not of this earth, or rather, not of the earth, as charted by papal decree. The continents etched into its surface, bent and twisted into impossible coastlines. No Europe, no Rome, only shapes that belonged to stories whispered in the east, and visions born in desert caves. The globe rested on a stone base carved with 7 seals, and beside it a chalice, cracked, bone-dry, its lip stained with something long since turned to dust, not gold, not jeweled, but heavier than either. It called not to kings, but to those who had knelt in darkness and chosen silence over salvation. "Is it the Grail?" Alaric asked. The scholar shook his head. "Older. The Grail was a shadow. This is the fire that cast it." He stepped forward and placed his palm over one of the 7 seals. At once, the air thickened. The torch sputtered. A low hum rose from beneath the stone. Not a sound, but a pressure, as if time itself had inhaled. And somewhere above, far beyond the chapel ceiling, a bell chimed, once, twice, 13 times. Each toll echoed down the chamber like the judgment of forgotten gods. Alaric's knees buckled. He clutched the edge of the mural wall, the one painted with knights disappearing into a fog that now seemed to breathe. The edges of the figures blurred, as if the stone no longer held them captive. "They hid it," he whispered, voice raw, "because it was never meant to be found." The scholar didn't blink. "Or because it changes those who do." A silence followed, so deep it rang in their bones. Then the floor beneath them groaned, not cracked, not broken, but shifted, as if awakening. The secrets, Alaric realized, had not been buried. They had been waiting for memory to return, waiting for the world to forget enough for them to rise again. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but in the blood that pounded in his ears. A path, a line of brotherhood, not bound by oaths or banners, but by a vision older than empire. A brotherhood of watchers, of dreamers, of traitors to power who had guarded something no crown could claim. Alaric turned to the scholar, his voice hoarse. "If we open this, there's no turning back," the scholar said. "Not for us, not for the church, not for history." The candle nearest the globe flickered, then went out. From above, footsteps, faint, uncertain. Someone else had entered the chapel. Or perhaps something called. The walls pulsed with cold. The vines in the carvings seemed to curl tighter. The angels bowing their heads as if in mourning. Alaric moved toward the chalice. His hand trembled. "The ones who came before us gave everything to hide it," he said. "And what if they were wrong?" the scholar asked. What if truth was never meant to be buried, only carried forward, one soul at a time? A breath passed between them, shared and sacred. Alaric touched the base of the globe. It did not move, but inside him, something did. The mural of the knights seemed to fade further into the fog, their torches vanishing one by one, not extinguished, passed on. The scholar whispered, "It begins again." Above them, wind howled through the chapel stone, like a voice too old to name, and beneath their feet, history began to tremble. The ropes hung like accusatory fingers in the icy dawn, swaying above the cobblestones outside Paris, not from wind, but from memory. They waited, not for justice, but for silence. The gallows had become an altar, and this morning it would drink not just of flesh and flame, but of legacy. A hush fell over the crowd as footsteps approached, bare feet on frost-bitten stone. A man robed in white, though stained by cold and time, walked as though the world had already ended. Jacques d'Aumale, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, walked to his death without chains. He needed none. His dignity bound him tighter than iron ever could. The crowd parted, not out of fear, but awe. Some whispered prayers in trembling Latin. A few children clung to their mother's eyes, too wide to knowing. This was no common heretic. This was the end of an age. Soldiers flanked him, their hands steady, their eyes haunted. They had heard the confessions wrung from torture, scripted by kings, but in the Grand Master's presence, those words now crumbled like Ashdod. The pyre loomed, a monstrous thing of stacked wood and soaked pitch, too large, too deliberate. It was meant to burn more than a man. Final punctuation. Maul turned, not to beg, not to proclaim innocence, but to look upon the people, the city, the sky. And as he did, someone called out from the edge of the crowd, a thin voice, neither child nor crone. "Did you find it?" they asked. The wind caught the words, almost stealing them, but they landed. He didn't speak. He only nodded. They tied him with care, as though afraid of him, even now. The ropes creaked around his wrists. The wood groaned under his weight. Then, as the torch was raised, he lifted his face to the overcast heavens and spoke not to the crowd, nor to the king, but to history. "God knows who is wrong," he said, "and he will avenge the innocent." The torch fell. Flame kissed hem, then robe, then beard. But the Grand Master did not scream. His voice, clear as cathedral bells, rose above the roar of fire. "Within the year you shall stand before him." And so it was. Pope Clement, who signed the order's death, fell. First, consumed by fever. Then Philip the Fair, the king whose greed lit this pyre, met his end hunting shadows. One by one, the architects of betrayal crumbled under time's quiet justice. The curse of Male, whispered by peasants and scribes alike, rippled through Europe like the last vow of a dying knight. But the question burned longer than the fire. Was it truly a curse? Others believe he left behind something far more potent than words, a sign, a secret, passed in the final seconds as smoke coiled heavenward, perhaps to a squire watching in silence, perhaps to no one at all. What is known is this: long after the flames died, and the crowd shuffled home, and the frost returned, something stirred beneath the ash. A parchment, small, torn at the edges, found by a stable boy sweeping the square. On it, a single mark, a red cross, faded, smudged, but unmistakable. It was not signed, it needed no name. The Templars had fallen. Yes, their castles emptied, their treasures seized, their symbols outlawed, but not all treasure is gold, and not all symbols burn. What d'Aumale carried to the pyre was not guilt or regret, but knowledge, something older than the order, a vow not yet fulfilled, a truth buried beneath centuries of blood and betrayal. Even now, Some believe that parchment was no coincidence, passed from one seeker to the next, each one carrying a fragment of the flame, whispering the name. No king could silence Jacques de Molay, the man who died with his eyes open. The fire took his body. Symbol still waits, not for justice, not for vengeance, but for the one who dares to follow the ashes. In the hush of spring, when the wind moves like memory through the almond groves, an old man knelt by the mouth of his cellar. His hands, once calloused by sword and flame, now trembled over a clay jar of honey. Southern Italy had forgotten him. His village had no name left on maps, and no pilgrims ever passed through the crumbling walls. Only the bees kept him company small, golden sentinels who knew not of kingdoms or crusades. He had once worn the red cross, once stood beneath banners flapping over Jerusalem's blood-soaked stones. But time had peeled the sigil from his skin, and silence had sealed his lips. For 50 years he spoke to no one of the Brotherhood, not even to God. Yet beneath the cellar floor, hidden behind stacks of lavender wine and old herbs, was a sword older than kings. Its hilt bore a sunburst, and letters no priest would bless. Hebrew, forbidden, sacred. He visited the sword only once a year, when the almonds bloomed white as bone. He would unwrap the oilcloth slowly, as though afraid the blade might whisper. And then he prayed, not to Rome, not to saints, but to something older, something that had met him long ago in a desert cave, where stars bent wrong and men bled for silence. That night, half a century past, had never left him. The wind had howled without breath. The sand had not stirred. The cave opened of its own will, not with tools, nor fire, nor force, just presence. Light poured out from nowhere. It had no shape, no warmth, only hunger. And what they found within had no name, not in Latin, not in Greek. It was a pulse, older than the earth. Most of his brothers had died that night, some by sword, some by something worse. He had walked, out blind in one eye, shaking, changed. He never returned to the Holy Land. He never spoke of what they uncovered. He buried it inside, like a splinter near the soul. But that spring, the bees acted strangely. They refused the almond blossoms. They gathered instead around the cellar door, thick as smoke. They moved in spirals, slow, deliberate, unnatural. He watched them with eyes dulled by age, but somewhere deep in his chest, the ember stirred. The memory had awakened. Something was coming. She arrived at dusk, a rider, no older than 16, her face hidden beneath a rough woolen veil. Her satchel sagged with weight, not weapons, but words. She said nothing, not even when he opened the door and peered at her with the caution of a cornered wolf. She only handed him a parchment. He held it like fire. His eyes scanned the diagram, drawn in brown ink, the familiar geometry of vaults buried beneath sands. A phrase in Coptic script no living monk would dare to write, and at the bottom, stamped in dried wax, a seal in red, a seal he'd last seen crumbling in a Templar crypt. As the walls gave way and the curses whispered, his knees buckled, not from fear, but reverence. For a long time, he said nothing. The girl waited, silent as stone. Then, with trembling hands, he turned from the firelight and walked into the cellar. He moved the jars, he moved the wine. He uncovered the oilcloth. The blade beneath still gleamed, untouched by rust, untouched. by time, he returned and placed it in her arms. "Tell them," he whispered, "that we remembered." She nodded. No tears, no thanks, only duty. She rode into the night, hooves muffled by dirt. He stood at the edge of the path until the shadows swallowed her. The village slept, but the bees rose. Above the cellar, they formed a spiral in the air, pulsing like breath. No one saw it. No one heard the words the old man spoke next, words not found in Scripture, words that came before Scripture, words that had waited half a century to be uttered again. That night, he did not sleep. He placed fresh kindling in the hearth. He cleaned the last of the jars, and he laid down beneath the almond trees, his back to the stars, his eyes closed. By morning, he was gone. But on the threshold of the cellar, someone had drawn a mark in ash and honey. The same red cross, tilted slightly, as if to signal motion, as if to say, this is not an ending. The Templars had vanished from the world, but their memory had not died. It had simply learned to wait. And now, in silence, in symbols, in secret bloodlines, it was beginning again. The next light would not rise over Jerusalem. It would rise over forgotten maps, lost names, and children with veiled faces. The order still breathed, but not where anyone was looking. So now you know the Knights Templar were never just warriors in white cloaks. They were guardians of riddles, wanderers between faith and fire, bound not only by swords, but by silence, symbols, and something far older than any church dares speak. Of history, buried them beneath accusations, trials, and flames. But memory, true memory, doesn't burn so isolate a night. As you lie in darkness, listen closely, for not every secret sleeps. Some still walk, cloaked in shadows, hidden in bloodlines, etched into stone no eye has seen. The Templars are not gone, they are simply waiting. This is medieval history, and this was only the beginning.